All right, next let's look at the roles that different species play in ecosystems. So we've got another term we need to look at here, and that's called a niche. Okay, a niche is defined as an organism's role in the ecosystem, and that includes everything that it does to survive and reproduce. That means where it sleeps, where it hunts, what it eats, what time it eats, what eats it. All of those things together make up its niche. And as long as species occupy different niches in an environment, even if they're kind of similar animals, if they occupy different niches, they can live together in an environment without causing too much problem, without too much negative competition or things like that. But when those niches start to overlap, that's when you see competition. So if you have two species that both try to survive on the same type of food, for example, they will have to compete for that food. And in many cases, one species will come out on top of the other, and the other species will start to decline. So as long as niches are different, everything's fine. So a good example of that would be a hawk and an owl. So both of these are species that we have around here. Hawks tend to live in the tops of trees when they nest. Owls tend to be farther down in the kind of like the thick of the tree. Hawks tend to hunt in the prairie, like out in the open, where owls tend to hunt more in forested or wooded areas. Hawks hunt during the day and owls hunt at night. So there really isn't a lot of competition, even though they may eat the same food a lot of the time. There's not as much competition between them because they occupy different enough niches that they can survive around each other fairly comfortably. Okay, another example with this would be these warblers. So there's 5 different species of warblers shown here, and the competition amongst them is fairly reduced because they all feed in different parts of the tree. So the bay-breasted up at the top there only really feeds at the very top or the crowns of the tree. The Blackburnian below that one is also the top of the tree, but a little bit farther down, so they can work with that. The black-throated green, more so in the middle. The Cape May, that middle, and then down the center of the tree. And then the yellow-rumped, really only at the bottom of the tree. So because of that, they can all exist in the same ecosystem, potentially even in the same tree, without causing too much problem. Now there's going to be maybe a little territorial fighting and whatever. That's just normal between birds, but they could all exist in an environment without being pushed out or running out of food or negatively impacting that species too much. So those are good examples of how different niches can exist without interfering with each other. The more niches that an environment has, the more species potentially that area could have. So if an environment really only has a few niches available, there may only be certain 5 or 6 species that can exist there, because anything else that comes in would have to compete with an existing species to try to take over that niche. If an environment like, let's say, the rainforest, though, there are probably millions of niches in the rainforest, depending on when you eat and what you eat and whether you're on the bottom or in the canopy or in the understory or different parts of the forest. All of those are going to be different, provide different niches for those animals. So that's why there's such a huge diversity of species that can live in the rainforest, because there's so many little niches that those species can occupy. Especially if a species is very specialized, right? Like koala bears, for example, are very specialized. They really only eat eucalyptus. Now that's fine as long as they're the only real thing that eats eucalyptus. But if something else comes in that is maybe more aggressive than a koala, it may start to push the koalas out and eat the eucalyptus, and now the koalas could be in trouble. So that's kind of what could happen with these sorts of species. The next thing you need to be aware of is a term we call exotic species. Exotic species are any species that's not native to an ecosystem. So sometimes this happens naturally, right? Animals will tend to to move around, to migrate. Maybe there's a drought occurring somewhere, and so they've moved to a new area. Weather changes, all those kinds of things will cause species to move around a little bit naturally. Most of the time, though, we're talking about it in terms of human activities, and sometimes that's an intended human activity, like we purposely moved these species, and sometimes it's a completely accidental process. So, for example, humans tend to have livestock. So when we move to a new area, we take pigs and sheep and cattle and horses and things like that with us. Those are not native species to some areas that they've been brought, and sometimes that can cause problems. Sometimes it's unintended because, let's say, a mouse or a rat on a ship, nobody purposely brought rats to, let's say, Australia, but if they were in a ship that went to Australia, they could have got there that way. A common one here is weeds. So let's say you bring grain with you to feed a population. In that grain store, there may be a few weed seeds in there with the grain, and if those seeds happen to get out and start growing, that is now a problem. So let me just give you a couple of examples of this. This is the common starling. So in the 1980s, someone who was a fan of Shakespeare decided he would bring all of the birds that were in Shakespeare's play to North America. So I don't even know how he did this, but he somehow got all those birds captured, brought them over, I would assume, by boat or plane, I don't even know, but brought them all over and released them in Central Park in New York City, thinking that this would just be kind of cool that all the birds from Shakespeare's plays existed in New York City. But this bird in particular, the common starling, went crazy. And there are now probably millions of these birds in North America. In fact, it's now one of the most abundant and widespread birds in all of North America. So covering all of America and most of the southern part, the densely populated part of Canada as well. And the yellow band there is where it's seasonal, so it would be there part of the year, but not necessarily all of it. The problem is that they're quite aggressive. So things like mountain bluebirds and other species that before were fine, were completely, had their niche was available to them, have been outcompeted by the starlings. They've been pushed out of their nesting sites. They've been pushed out of feeding sites. And so the mountain bluebird and other species that are, depending on where you live, that species may be different that's being affected, but that species has been pushed out. And so the number of those native species has declined, in some cases quite dramatically, because the starling population has exploded so rapidly. Okay? This is the cane toad. It was introduced in Australia, I think in the mid-1930s. And it was introduced because they had cane plantations where they were growing cane sugar, and they have a cane beetle that was causing problems. So this toad had been used successfully in places like Puerto Rico and other places to help protect their cane populations. And so they decided, hey, maybe this will work in Australia. So a small group was introduced. Originally, it was a small test group. It went for a little while, and then they paused it so they could study what was happening. And then when the study was done, they opened it back up. They probably released in total a couple thousand of these into the wild. It's currently estimated that there could be over 200 million cane toads in Australia. So these pictures above here show that from 1940 to 1960 to 75 to 1980, how dramatically that population has spread in Australia. And this one right behind me, this darker area right here, is where they are currently, whenever this photo was done anyway, this research study. And all of this lighter gray area is where they will be. They're estimated to be. In fact, some have already been found over even on these far western parts of Australia. So very rapidly spreading. And part of the problem is that it doesn't have a natural predator in Australia. There are things that try to eat it, but one of the problems with the cane toad is that its skin, there's a little gland, you can kind of see it a little bit just to the left of its eye there. It has a gland called the parotid gland that's producing a toxin, and that toxin is extremely toxic to most species who try to eat it. So what happened, especially in all these areas that it's spread to, is that the populations of the predators have been declining. So predatory reptiles, even crocodiles and snakes and things like that. As the cane toad moves in, their populations tend to decline because they try to eat the toads and it's poisonous and they die, or at the very least, they're very sick, and that reduces their ability to thrive and fill their own niche. So this species is causing a lot of problems in Australia and is still currently spreading. I think the number I read was about a speed of 5 kilometers per year, at least, that these were, maybe it was 50. It's either way, they're spreading very rapidly across Australia and causing a lot of problems. In Alberta, we have a very aggressive campaign to stop these guys. These are called zebra mussels. So you'll remember a couple of years ago in Waterton, they shut down the lake. You weren't allowed to bring in any motorized boats or anything like that, in large part because of these guys. They didn't want to allow zebra mussels into Waterton Lake. The problem is these are, again, an exotic species. There's no natural predators or anything to fight these, to eat these. And so when they get into a body of water, they just go crazy. Nothing can eat them, and they end up eating all the food or covering things like this up above here, to the point where there's no sites or anything left for other species to grow. And then the existing species there are just pushed out or starve or at least very dramatically decline because we have no way of stopping the zebra mussels. The same thing is true for a lot of plants. So that one up in the top left over there, that is leafy spurge. The one right here, that one's purple loosestrife, just above. And this one right behind me is called Eurasian milfoil. So you'll see that kind of a leafy plant in bodies of water. The one on the far bottom left is called giant hogweed. That one, if it touches your skin, it leaves it's like a sappy kind of a substance, and it's very irritating to the skin, almost like a poison ivy kind of an experience. And then this one right here is called brown knapweed. Now this is only 5 that I just grabbed really quickly off the internet. There are probably, well, dozens at least, and potentially even hundreds of different weeds and species that have been introduced here. But because they're exotic species, they don't have a natural predator, or I guess in this case herbivore. Well, there's nothing that eats them. And so if you get a species that comes in that grows very rapidly and nothing eats, it starts to very quickly start to crowd out some of the native plants and flowers and other things that grow here. And now their territory, their ability to grow and reproduce is greatly diminished. So in Waterton, for example, there are people that are hired every year, and this is all they deal with. They walk around the park and find plants that aren't native to the park, and they remove them. And they're very carefully and specifically trained on what plants are native to the park and which ones aren't. And that's all they do, just try to keep these plants from moving in and taking over the park, trying to maintain its natural habitat. If you're a farmer, you've probably seen some of these. You maybe had to deal with these if you have a farm or a ranch. That might be common to you. So some of the problems with exotic species, just to remember, are, number one, there may be no natural population controls. So that could include things like diseases or predators. We've talked about this with the frogs, what's the name of the disease? You guys know the one I'm talking about. It's wiping out the amphibians. It's lost. It's totally just gone. You know what I'm talking about. you know. So sometimes it's because there's no natural disease or anything to affect them. Another problem is they may be carrying a disease that can cause a lot of problems. Chytrid fungus, that's the one. Native species may not be able to compete with them. So sometimes the new species coming in is more aggressive, or it's bigger, or for whatever reason, it just takes over those nesting sites, those feeding sites, whatever they might be, and causes declines in the population because they're crowded out of those niches. And prey organisms may not have defenses. So if this was a predatory animal, there may be species of animal or insect or plant that don't have any kind of natural defense against this thing, and so they can get wiped out, or at the very least dramatically reduced in their population. So that's kind of the niche idea and how it gets upset with exotic species. If you have any questions or concerns with anything, just let me know.